Liftoff and the clock has started. Yes, sir. Reading you loud and clear.
Roger, roll, Discovery.
Discovery, roger, go from.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the February 19, 2020 edition of Space News. This is Michael Abdillah, and tonight I'm joined by Tina Stagg and Angelo Di Grazia, and we are all from the Space Association of Australia. So let's get the show started with some Australian space news. Australian rocket startup Gilmour Space has received a $3 million grant from the government to help improve rockets in a way that could add significant savings to the launch process. The grant will be used to fund the development of flight-ready lightweight rocket fuel tanks that could save as much as 30% of the weight of current designs, while saving up to 25% of the cost of launch. The project is a collaboration between Gilmour, the University of Southern Queensland, and is supported by a $12.5 million total investment. The tanks will be constructed of carbon fibre, which will be wound using a robot designed for the purpose, using exotic filament materials that can stand up to extreme temperatures, radiation and other stresses of space. Gilmour Space and USQ entered into a strategic partnership last year to work together on research and development of new rocket technologies. Gilmour Space plans to launch its first commercial rocket into orbit sometime in 2022. Moving to our friends in New Zealand at Rocket Lab. Rocket Lab will launch a satellite to the moon for NASA to prepare for the Lunar Gateway. Rocket Lab has been awarded a contract to launch a CubeSat on behalf of NASA for the agency's Capstone experiment. The aim of the experiment is to put the Capstone CubeSat into cislunar orbit, that is, the region in between the Earth and the Moon. The same orbit that NASA will eventually use for its Gateway moon-orbiting space station. The Capstone mission will use Rocket Lab's Photon platform, which is an in-house designed and built satellite bus that can support a range of payloads. In this case, Photon will transport the 25-kilogram Capstone CubeSat from Earth's orbit to the Moon, at which point Capstone will fire up its own small engines to enter its target cislunar orbit. In total, the launch contract with Rocket Lab has a fixed price of $9.95 million. And over to Tina.
Thanks, Mike, and good evening, space fans. In NASA news, NASA will open another astronaut selection round next month. The agency announced last week that it would solicit astronaut applications from March 2 to the 31st. NASA is making some changes in this round, including requiring a master's degree in a STEM field or related education, and will make applicants take an online assessment at the beginning of the application process. NASA plans to select a new class by the middle of next year. And in NASA's commercial resupply services, a Cygnus cargo spacecraft named the SS Robert H. Lawrence launched to the International Space Station at the weekend. Robert Lawrence Jr. was a United States Air Force officer, test pilot, and the first African-American astronaut. In June 1967, Lawrence successfully completed the US Air Force Test Pilot School in Class 66B at Edwards Air Force Base in California. The same month, he was selected by the USAF as an astronaut in the Air Force's Manned Orbital Laboratory, or MOL program, becoming the country's first African-American astronaut. Lawrence was killed in the crash of an F-104 starfighter at Edwards Air Force Base on December 8, 1967, at 32 years of age. He was flying backseat on the mission as the instructor pilot for the flight of a test trainee. Had Lawrence lived, he likely would have been among the MOL astronauts who became NASA Astronaut Group 7 after MOL's cancellation, all of whom flew on the Space Shuttle. to NASA's Commercial Crew Program, and the SpaceX Crew Dragon spacecraft has arrived at its launch site. NASA and SpaceX are preparing for the company's first flight test with astronauts to the International Space Station as part of the agency's Commercial Crew Program. The SpaceX Crew Dragon will launch atop a Falcon 9 rocket with NASA astronauts Bob Behnken and Doug Hurley from Historic Launch Complex 39A from NASA's Kennedy Space Center in Florida. The flight, the first to launch astronauts from US soil since the Space Shuttle program ended in 2011, could take place as early as this northern spring. A tentative date of the 7th of May has been set, but it could be earlier or later. The spacecraft is generally ready to fly, and it's now mainly the paperwork, including a thorough evaluation of the recent launch abort mission, which remains. NASA also wants 2 more parachute tests before the flight. The spacecraft will undergo final testing and pre-launch processing in a SpaceX facility at nearby Cape Canaveral Air Force Station. And to NASA's lunar program. The White House's fiscal year 2021 budget proposal requests a 12% increase in NASA's budget to fund the Artemis program. The proposal, released last week, seeks $25.2 billion for NASA in fiscal 2021, including major increases in funding for a lunar lander and related technologies needed to support a human return to the moon by 2024. NASA said the cost of the Artemis program until the 2024 landing would be $35 billion. While the budget boosts Artemis, it plans to cancel several science missions and NASA's Education Office, similar to previous proposals that were rejected by Congress. And back to Michael.
Thank you, Tina. Let's look at NASA's planetary and space science programs. NASA's Mars 2020 spacecraft has arrived in Florida for launch preparations. The spacecraft's major components, including the rover, arrived at the Kennedy Space Center last week on a pair of C-17 cargo planes. The spacecraft will undergo final tests and integration before its launch on an Atlas V in July. Meanwhile, Voyager 2 is alive and well again. NASA announced that the spacecraft's instruments were operational again after being shut down last month when other systems drained power, a glitch linked to the failure of the spacecraft to perform a scheduled spin maneuver. The spacecraft, launched more than 40 years ago, continues to collect data and should have enough power to operate until the mid-2020s. NASA has selected 4 finalists for its next round of the Discovery program of planetary science missions. The 4 concepts announced last week include 2 missions to Venus, 1 to Jupiter's volcanic moon Io, and 1 to Triton, Neptune's largest moon. Each concept will receive $3 million for a 9-month concept study, and NASA plans to select 1 or 2 of the missions in 2021 for launch in the mid to late 2020s. And back to Tina.
Thanks, Mike. And in US Space Force news, the Pentagon is requesting $15.4 billion for the US Space Force in its 2021 budget proposal. The figure is from Air Force accounts for programs that are being transferred to the Space Force as that service stands up, including various satellite programs and space launches. The budget proposal includes funding to complete construction of the military's Consolidated Space Operations Facility in Colorado. And 2 Florida space facilities will soon get new names as part of the stand-up of the US Space Force. Brigadier General Douglas Scheiss, commander of the 45th Space Wing, said Cape Canaveral Air Force Station would become Cape Canaveral Space Force Station, while Patrick Air Force Base would become Patrick Space Force Base. And over to Michael again.
Thank you, Tina. It's turning to ESA and European news. and Atlas V has successfully launched a European-American mission to study the Sun. The rocket lifted off from Cape Canaveral and deployed the Solar Orbiter spacecraft nearly 53 minutes later. The spacecraft, a European-led mission with NASA participation, will pass slightly closer to the Sun than Mercury in its orbit. Its orbit will become more inclined over time to allow it to observe the poles. Scientists believe that its observations, in conjunction with NASA's Parker Solar Probe and other spacecraft, will help them better understand the Sun's magnetic field and the development of solar flares and coronal mass ejections. And over to Angelo.
Thanks, Mike. Let's head south to India. Indian astronauts have started training in Russia. 4 Indian Air Force pilots recently started a 12-month training program at the Russian Cosmonaut Training Center in Star City outside Moscow. The 4, whose names have not been released, will train for India's first crewed spaceflight, expected in 2022 and carrying 1 or 2 people. Across to Iran. An Iranian rocket failed to put a satellite into orbit last week. The Seymour rocket lifted off from the Imam Khomeini spaceport carrying a small communications satellite called Zafar. Iranian government officials said that while the rocket reached space, it failed to gain enough velocity to attain orbit and fell back to Earth. The government said it will attempt to launch another Zafar satellite as soon as June. The failure is the latest setback for Iran's space program, which suffered 2 launch failures earlier last year and a launch pad explosion during preparations for another launch last August. Across to the United States and SpaceX, the former head of NASA's human spaceflight program is now working for SpaceX. Bill Gerstenmaier, who retired from NASA late last year, is working as a consultant for SpaceX's reliability team, the company said. Gerstenmaier had been the Associate Administrator for Human Exploration and Operations from 2011 until NASA Administrator Jim Bridenstine reassigned him to a special advisor position last July. Gerstenmaier's new role, considered by many commentators to be a coup for SpaceX, has prompted praise from people as varied as former NASA Administrator Charles Bolden and Roscosmos head Dmitry Rogozin. Continuing on with commercial space news, we go to Boeing. Boeing will perform a complete review of the software on its CST-100 Starliner commercial crew vehicle after 2 serious errors. Boeing officials said the company would re-verify about 1 million lines of code after the revelation last week that engineers found a second problem with software that could have caused a spacecraft service module to bump into the crew module after separation and just before re-entry. NASA said there were numerous process escapes in the design, development and test cycle for software for the vehicle. The agency will use an organisational safety review to better understand why Boeing's software development process failed to catch the errors. To Virgin Galactic. Virgin Galactic Spaceship 2 has arrived in New Mexico for a final series of flight tests. The suborbital spaceplane named VSS Unity was ferried from California to Spaceport America in New Mexico last week on its White Knight 2 aircraft. The company plans a series of flight tests at the spaceport in the coming months to become familiar with operations at the site and to test upgrades to the vehicle and its new passenger cabin. Virgin has previously stated it expects to begin commercial operations at the spaceport by June. Continuing on with commercial space, Astra Space, a small launch vehicle company, has emerged from stealth mode but has yet to reveal many details about its plans. Astra Space announced its intent to provide frequent launches of small satellites for as little as $1 million each. Bargain price. The company's first orbital launch is scheduled for as soon as February 21 from Alaska and will be the first of 2 launches for the DARPA Launch Challenge. But Astra has revealed few technical details about its rocket and has not announced any customers beyond the DARPA competition and a schedule of CubeSat rideshare missions. And back to Mike.
Thank you, Angelo. And finally tonight, a flyby of a distant Kuiper Belt object has helped scientists understand how the solar system formed. Scientists published papers in the journal Science last week about the flyby of Arrokoth, also known as 2014 MU-69, by NASA's New Horizons spacecraft at the beginning of 2019. Data from the flyby confirmed speculation that Arrokoth is a primordial object, a planetesimal created in the early era of the solar system. Scientists believe that Arrokoth formed through a process known as cloud collapse, with its two lobes coming together at very low speeds. And that's all we have time for tonight. Thank you, Tina. Thank you, Angelo. And we'll speak to you again next week. Good night.